Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick, and over there, as we just learned, probably roughly about 1,000 miles away, is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
1,169 miles driving, but we're assuming that maybe that
That's
change can be
shorter.
cut off, as the
Yeah.
crow flies. I gotta
Yeah.
go. I gotta go
Yeah.
around Lake Michigan here.
Yeah. For
So
context, he's in Michigan and I'm in Colorado. And so
yeah,
we
yeah,
think that he could fly over Lake Michigan
yeah.
if
If
we
we
were
were,
just measuring pure distance,
yes, yes.
I would imagine.
Indeed. All right. So we are on Genesis 3:22. We are rapidly coming to an end here with Genesis 3. So this is exciting. I'm going to read that though for us real quick. Just a forewarning. I find this to be one of the strangest verses in the Bible, and we'll get to why here at the very end.
Excellent.
So then the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever."
I
So
always thought this one was strange too. I'm just going to throw that
it,
out there.
good. Then we're on the same page here.
Yeah.
I think probably for the same reason why then. So to start with here real quick, we see that the serpent, his half truth has been fulfilled, right? He said that man and woman would become somewhat like God. And here we see God himself describe that they are somewhat like God, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that is interesting. And the knowing here, by the way, is the same that we saw earlier in this chapter, first applied to God, right? The idea that God knew something. And so by putting that here, it's sort of as though God is saying that Adam and Eve have become like God in terms of the reality of knowing good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
And at least understanding sort of their existence and what that kind of means and the significance of that.
Mm-hmm.
But knowing that, right, knowing what good and evil is, means that one must now be judged by that, right? And so what God is saying here is that, well, look, because you know the difference and have to be judged by it, you can't stay in the garden because you fail to live up to that standard. So that's what we're getting here. Now, let's get to this most interesting part and why I say this is one of the strangest verses in the Bible. This verse ends on an unfinished thought. I'm sure as I read that, you probably thought I was stopping mid-sentence, but no, this was just an unfinished thought by God, which is interesting, right? So actually, I'll
read it again.
Yeah, I'm going to read it once more to call that out, right? Then the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." There it is. So just stops. Mm-hmm. Lest that happens. And then it goes on here to say, right, that the Lord sends them out from the garden. But he doesn't say it here, right? And that's really fascinating. Like, first of all, who is God talking to? Again, one of the weird questions why would we take this historically? Because if he is talking to someone, he's talking to some third party. This isn't spoken directly to the man and the woman because he's referring to them in the third person. But there's this strange unfinished thought, right? And clearly this is intentional. I personally can't think of anywhere else in the Bible that this occurs quite like this. I certainly don't know of any other where God offers up an unfinished thought. That's not something we see by any regular means. So we've talked before, right? The words here aren't wasted, right? And especially in these early chapters of Genesis, these things all mean something. So what must be meant by God stopping suddenly with a half-finished thought and sentence? It's very weird. So if we look at that and think, there's a few different things that people have suggested. Many people have suggested that this is meant to show how hurried God was to get them out of the garden, given that they had sinned, right? This seems very odd, this particular interpretation, right? because he certainly could have gone through this entire inquisition that he did, and these words he spoke to them outside the garden if he wanted to, right? And he could have given them their new coverings outside the garden if he wanted to. So that idea seems to be kind of inconsistent, right, with the narrative that we've seen thus far. It's a little weird to say, well, he went through all of that and he took time to give them their new garments, and then suddenly he was just in a hurry to get them out of there, right? Very odd, very strange to sort of interpret that way. I think if that's what was meant to be conveyed here, that would be very poor literature, and the Bible is most certainly not poor literature. So I think we should avoid that interpretation. I think there's some issues with that one. Do you see the same issues with that, or no?
Well, ordering is really significant. Ordering is really, it's important, at least in following the thought process that's going on inside God's head. Because I think it's interesting that he would give the animal skins inside the garden as opposed to outside.
Yes.
Potentially protecting their shame, guarding their shame first. It's also interesting that this thought doesn't come up first, because all of the other action happens and then God thinks this.
Right.
Which means that there's a degree of importance that God was addressing. And it is interesting that he addresses the need to protect humanity temporarily from their shame before thinking this too. So all that just to say that, yeah, the ordering seems really, really significant, that this would then come after all of that has been established and secured.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But yeah, the idea of God now in a hurry or acting with haste, that seems,
well, the
only
justification for that would be to say that I don't think necessarily hurry, but the idea that he's allowing the actions to say something rather than allowing, because he does then take them out of the garden, that the actions finish the thought.
But it could, so let's put it this way. It could be written because God realized they had become like him. And so that they would no longer grab from the tree of the tree of life, he placed them outside the garden. Instead, we're given this quotation that is spoken to, I guess, God speaking to himself, or I don't know, the angels, or some sort of divine counsel. Right, yeah. But he is speaking, like they're taking the time to give us this narrative first, and then God puts them outside the garden, right? So to say he was hurried seems odd, because why give the narrative then? Like God could just put them outside the garden and say, this is why I'm putting them outside the garden.
Yeah, exactly.
Apologies there, phone call. Anyways, so yeah, so that part seems weird to me. So I want to suggest a different way of thinking about this. And I think there might be something to be gained from looking at this moment from the perspective of the Bible as describing the maturation of humans and humanity, right? Which is something we've talked about before, right? This idea that there is sort of a pattern of maturation. And we will even see that, by the way, when we get to, we're going to look at Noah in a little bit, right? And kind of a forgotten narrative of Noah is between Noah and the Tower of Babel. There's this story of Noah sinning, right? And the idea of that Ham, right, being cursed, and actually not Ham directly, but we'll get to all that, the specific details. But the point is, that is another moment of sin, right? That is described, and we'll get to it when we get to it, but it's kind of like a more mature version of what we see here in the story of Adam and Eve. It's a more intricate version, if you will, in terms of the pattern that's followed. So even there, we can see kind of this maturation idea. We talked about the idea of the God not mentioning anything about consumption of animals, and then specifically mentioning consumption of animals later on, right? So we've talked about this maturation idea, and I think that's what we might see in this as well. Is some furthering of this as humans sort of mature, because we might see a moment like this, not so much as the punishing father, right? Sending their child to their room, which is sometimes what I think Christians interpret this verse as, God has had enough and you're now being sent to your room, which in this case is the rest of the world. But we might look at this as a parent watching children grow kind of from one phase of maturity to the next, right? It's often that too, that idea, speaking from the place of having kids and watching them, that process is often associated with recognizing that they've become something a little more like you, right? What happens is you realize your kids are maturing because you realize, oh, that's a little more like me, or a little more like an adult, right? If you will. And so I think there's something of that to this verse, right? Because up until this moment in the Bible, God has seemed distant, almost unfeeling. He's even a little bit mechanical, right? In the way things are approached and the way he deals with things. And so we don't really see the depth of God as kind of this loving, compassionate being, right? We don't see that sort of portrayed. But I think that this might actually be one of the best early examples we have of God's love on display. And because this would be just as a child might feel their parents' love, right? As a baby, there comes a point when they now truly recognize that their parents love it. So it's something that they feel, and then it's something that they sort of like see more tangibly and can understand what's there at a certain point. And so I think what we might look here and see is that there's a way in which this moment almost has maybe Adam and Eve recognizing that love in a way, right? Because as God sends Adam and Eve out from the garden, and here we get to what you talked about, the order of things, it's akin to a parent recognizing their child is moving from one phase of life to another, right? And part of that process is equipping them for it. So the garment of skins coming before, right? Equipping them for that next phase is a part of that, right? But as parents, these moments, it also means like some innocence is lost too, right? And without innocence, you can't grab out and take from the tree of life, in the story here. So, but as a parent, when you see these moments, it's kind of when you recognize these moments of maturation, it's a complete wave of emotions. And one of them being sadness, even one of them being joy, one of them being remorse, almost that these things are past, excitement about what's to come, all these different things. But there is a sadness to it, right? And there's a sadness that as innocence fades, right? As we see our children and innocence fading from their life, we realize that life is going to be more difficult for them to navigate, right? The more they become aware of life, the more and it's something we all deal with, right? The more it's harder to navigate. It's just harder to struggle through life and figure out what to do, where to do, how to live life is more difficult as you become less innocent in a way. But at the root of all that emotional sort of overwhelming you feel at seeing your kids mature, you feel an overwhelming sense of love, right? That is the primary thing. And I think it's the kind of love that could stop you from finishing a sentence, right? And that's when I look at this verse and I see God stop, to me, the way I see it is it's a loving father who is catching himself, before tears. That's almost right. Like that's why he's stopping, because and God obviously can't be overcome with emotion, but he feels all of those emotions in a way, because it's who he is. He is all of those things. So I think when I look at this verse, that's what I see right there is just all of the emotions that God feels in watching us and watching us mature, and all of that is sort of captured in the pause, I guess, at the end of this phrase that doesn't finish the sentence.
Yeah. I like that. I think the things that occurred to me is that also is as you're transitioning phases and in a life, you would also describe what that phase is going to look like. And that's, we talked about the serpent's the only one that's actually cursed.
Yeah.
And so there's this description that God gives to the man and to the woman of what this next phase will look like. So not only is he providing the skins as coverings and preparing them, but he's also mentally preparing them for that. That's very interesting. I think it's interesting too that that's where he stops on, is lest they eat from the tree of life, which I think the thing that occurs to me around that is that, like, perhaps there's this degree to which humanity is prepared to go out into the world, but they're not prepared to assume the status of God, or assume the status that is implied by eating from the tree of life.
Right.
As you look at the maturation of humanity, it's like, no, there's a lot before they're able to do that.
Yeah, I think part of that is that innocence lost.
Yeah.
Because that's why they can't assume that, is they're no longer innocent.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The thing that I think of, if we're following the parents' analogy, it would be like turning the keys of your house over to your kids as soon as they turn 18. And it's like, no, they have so many other things to do. You kick them out and they go figure out their own path in their own way. And then you might pass that down to them, and they may inherit that.
Right.
Rather than
something like that.
Rather than being given right away as they're being kicked out of it. There's other stages between that and something else, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you don't go right from being a kid to running the family business.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's these stages of maturation that they still have to go through. And so that's why they're prevented from having from the tree of life, because they're not prepared for that.
They are not prepared for that, but they're also prepared enough to no longer be in the nursery. We even talked about the idea of the word for garden here meaning kind of nursery garden.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
And yeah.
But that's the interesting thing, is it's like this is like you could use it as a literary trope of like the rich kid who finally this is Buddha, the rich kid who finally gets out on his own for once.
Right.
And they don't have, or this is like a Rolling Stone too, but they don't have the protectings of that, of what their parents have established. But truth be told, if that kid is following a trajectory, relatively properly, they rebuild what they left, if that makes sense, to some degree, and hopefully better.
Right.
And maybe their parents will eventually help them along with that too. But there's this stage in which they can't go from being, it's improper for them to reach an age of maturity where they should be kicked out and go somewhere else and just inherit where they're at.
Right. Yeah. That's no good.
That would be the eating of the tree of life.
Right.
I think that may be what's being
something like that.
And so the choking up that's happening, the emotion that's being overcome, is the recognition, is that God does have to send them away so that they don't inherit what's right there.
Yeah. It's
immediately.
It is maturation. It's reaching a different phase, and there's a lot that goes into it, right? There's so many things that, I know one day my kids will head out onto their own, and you'll feel like hopefully you've given them garments, right? Hopefully you've prepared them enough. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, that their innocence is gone and it's going to be difficult, and there's much to face out there, and then you just hope that they can reach a point where they can, I guess, reach from the tree of life again, right? Which is ultimately what humanity is working towards, and then with the help of Christ finally attaining that place again. So all right, what does it mean when God stops his sentence short? That's what we're really trying to get at here. And I think it's a little more than just haste, right? There's other ways the story could have been told if the idea was to imply haste. So I think it's something a little bit deeper than that. So all right, with that, we're going to wrap up, and just a couple more verses left to go, and we'll be done with Genesis 3, and then we'll sort of look at a few different things considering this story as a whole. So until then, like, subscribe, follow, review, check out our mailing list, email us yourself, unschooledtheology@protonmail.com, and we'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.